Once we started to get sight on that journey, when we added the billions and we were celebrating the billions that we were penetrating of basically the world's population, all of a sudden we started to realize, hey, we're going to run out of people. So we have two options. Either we make more people or we start to connect new things. And we said the first sounded more fun, which was a joke internally. But the second one is really where we started to see microprocessors and the technology of microprocessors entering into almost everything. And that was a parallel universe.
Welcome to another episode of Transmissions from Tomorrow, the show that gives you an inside route to the people driving the digital transformation of business and technology in the world of telecommunications. And I'm your host, Des Blanchfield. And I'm very excited to share that today I have with me in the studio Ulf Ewaldsson. Ulf, how are you today?
I'm very fine, Des. Thank you.
Thank you so much for making time available to catch up with me in the studio when you're a very busy day. And I know you have a hard stop, so let's get straight into things. I understand over there today, and you're in Kista. I've learnt to pronounce it properly, about 20 minutes north of Stockholm near the airport, aren't you, from memory?
I am. This is what they called the Mobile Valley before, but this is where mobile telephony once had its cradle in Sweden.
My first night there when we headed over from, I think we had a night in Stockholm and then we came over to Kista, and we got there quite late, about 11 o'clock, but it's still very bright. I went walking around. It was freezing cold, 2 layers of clothing on. I think I walked for about an hour and 45 minutes around, and I didn't run out of Ericsson's campus. It's that large. But what was interesting, I woke up the next day and there was a couple of inches of snow on the ground. I understand it's pretty cold there today as well.
It is very cold here, but the Swedes wish it was a little bit colder because everyone is hoping for a white Christmas. We have a little bit of layer of snow on the ground, but we need more to have a full celebration.
I'm very jealous because our equivalent of a white Christmas here in Australia was 37 degrees Celsius yesterday with sandy white beaches and roasting. So
there are many Swedes that want that too, I can tell you.
I'm sure there are. Now, Ulf, let me just quickly introduce you, and then I'd like to throw to you to kind of give us a bit of background on yourself. So, Ulf Ewaldsson, you're the Senior Vice President and Head of the Business Area Digital Services part of Ericsson. Could you maybe just give us a quick introduction to yourself and that role?
Ericsson is divided in different business areas. One is networks, where we build mobile systems and deliver them to customers. And then we have my business area, which is really about our customers being able to monetize the whole infrastructure that they've bought. They're also able to manage it. They're able to basically all the IT systems that are surrounding a mobile implementation is in the area of digital services.
I remember talking to some of your colleagues when we had the privilege, and thank you very much for that again, for the tour behind the scenes in the Ericsson studio. And what struck me was that when I looked at the two parts of the business that you just described, you had sort of the infrastructure piece of rolling out poles and wires and antennas and all of the telephony piece. But really it seemed to me, and that was great, but it seemed to me the heart and soul of the organization was the business services component, because you do everything from sign up and registration new consumers. And I remember talking to Patrick Corwell a couple of days ago, and he said, you're signing up 1 million new subscribers a day worldwide.
It is an enormous growth, of course. And I mean, for me, when I started in Ericsson in 1990, mobile telephony was something that was for only a few very privileged people in the world. It was something that you dragged around. And if you had a car installation, it took several days to wire up a car to be able to make a mobile call. And we only had a few million subscribers in the world at the time, mostly businessmen. And today, I mean, we have now this year we're approaching 8 billion subscriptions in the world. And there are only 9 billion people something. So it's an amazing achievement. It's almost unbelievable what a journey this has been.
Well, it is. I mean, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was 1985 or 1986 when sort of the whole GSM standard became a thing, and carriers worked out that they could share that standard and that technology and talk to each other's networks. So we're really only talking about a couple of decades of that explosive transition from, as you said, the rare few with the money that could afford carrying a brick around or put in their car to now essentially.
And it was GSM. I think that's you're hitting on a very interesting point there. The foundation for our industry's growth has really been the standard, that we're creating a standard. Very few other industries in the world are built like that. Most other industries are built on proprietary development, or you come out with something that is better than anyone else. Typically, the IT industry is like that. You look at IBM or you look at Hewlett-Packard, all of those companies are built on technology that they were alone with in the beginning and that were later copied or built by other companies. In the telecom sector, and GSM is probably the best example of that, you first agree on a standard and then everybody go build. And that is another way. It takes a little bit longer in the standardization phase, but once you get there, you have these, I would say, explosive growth. I remember when we, in the 90s that you speak about, we used to go down here in Kista to the big canteen, and we used to hear our leader at the time stand there and explain to us that, you know, this could hit 100 million subscribers, which we thought was fantastic. And then a couple of years later, this could hit 1 billion. And then after that, we launched a new program that we called the Next Billion, which was to hit 2 billion. And today, I mean, we are where we are. So it's been an amazing journey built on a standard.
And it has even more growth in it. I remember reading in the 2017 Ericsson Mobility Report, which I have a hard copy that has been very seriously scribbled on, coffee stains on it, and notes all over the place. And, you know, I think there was a comment that there's another 2.6 to 5.5 billion different subscriptions, not just in the 8 billion human beings that you're talking about, but also just different subscription types. And you know, one example, I think, was it John Gamble and your team who was doing the behind-the-scenes tour for us, was talking about putting things like thousands of sensors on bridges and turning a normal iron bridge into a digital thing by making it a subscriber.
Once we started to get sight on that journey, when we added the billions and we were celebrating the billions that we were penetrating of basically the world's population, all of a sudden we started to realize, hey, we're going to run out of people. So we said, you know, we have two options. Either we make more people or we start to connect new things. And we said the first sounded more fun, which was a joke internally. But the second one is really where we started to see microprocessors and the technology of microprocessors entering into almost everything. And that was a parallel universe. So in the parallel universe, microprocessors started to go into everything from light switches to doors to locks to anything. And then we said, well, what if all those were connected? If they were all connected, they would be part of the same journey, but now a much bigger journey than when it came to connecting all the people in the world. So that's why we, you know, in 2009, Ericsson went out in one of the big trade shows we have which is in Barcelona. We went out and said that maybe there will be 50 billion connected devices by 2020. And that was, I don't know what happened. That became viral at the time. And the internet wasn't as big as it is now in 2009, but it went really viral. I remember traveling to China just a couple of months afterwards, and we had a meeting with the government in China, and they looked seriously at us, and they said, you know what? There could be 50 billion connected devices by 2020 in Chinese governments. I realized, oh, wow, we said that's an amazing insight. So I think in that sense, we knew that we were onto a completely new journey. Now we know that that's really happening. We're seeing, you know, connected devices added by the hundreds of millions per day.
Well, it's you know, I think there's a number of big shifts that have come about, and it's interesting to hear you say that places like China, or countries like China, and governments like the Chinese government, they you know, often big numbers like that don't surprise them. And I know a lot of people in the West are still really catching up with what it actually means to be in somewhere like Africa or India or China. But, you know, to put some context in that, I mean, there's like 1.1 billion people in Africa and 1.3 billion people in India and 1.5 billion people in China. So, you know, I always, when people sort of try to get their head around what that means, I always say, well, if you're in China and you're 1 in a million, there's 1,500 of you. So, you know, the scale of things is so much bigger. And, you know, I mean, Australia's only got 23 million people in it, and yet cities like Shanghai have 33.5 or 33.6 million people. So one city's got our entire national population. That you can see in China. I mean, even the art of city planning is reaching new levels because they know
And I'm not sure how familiar you are, but a few years ago, China really started to launch in their 5-year plans a very sustainable program, which is built on high tech and technology development. So you would see, even as we move towards 5G in mobile telephony, which is the next generation, which is even more built on IoT and mobility of IoT, there you would see China being one of the absolute leading nations in terms of using this technology to build a more sustainable society, more sustainable cities, and by that meaning that they can contain all these people that you talk about, Des.
Well, absolutely. I remember reading a stat a while ago where they'd built something like I think it was 220 megacities, and I think the definition of megacity was like, between 10 and 25 million people, and they built them empty, just rolled them out in preparation for growth. And another stat that really staggered me, which I had to go and research and check, was that I think America took something like 100 years to consume 4.5 gigatons of cement to build infrastructure. And yet in the last 8 years, China's used 6.5 gigatons. So nearly 1.5 times more in sort of the better part of a decade that took 10 decades for America to use. And I think there's some really exciting things to happen around that space, just, not just in mobility, but that's a no-brainer. But now, before we dive into the role that you have around, the Senior Vice President of Head of Business Area Digital Services, that's an exciting title, and I'd love to get into that in a minute. Before we do that, though, I'd love, if you don't mind, just to get a little bit of insight into you personally, because I saw some interesting things that I'd love to throw at you and get your response to. I understand you speak something like 4 languages: English, French, German, and Swedish, and I think you alluded to even some phrases in Indonesian recently. Tell us, is that something that comes from childhood, or is that a recent thing that you just liked languages?
No, those are educations that I took at school, and I have to admit that my French is probably pretty rusty by now. But Indonesian is because, or Bahasa, which they speak in Indonesia, is because I got married to an Indonesian woman, which has led me to really fantastic experience and eye-opening experiences of another big country with only 270 million people in it. And they have several megacities, but they are coming from a very poor situation, and they have a tremendous growth, and they have everything in front of them. But they also have a lovely society. And together with my wife, I have a farm in East Java, which is totally at contrast with everything that I'm doing at work, I will tell you.
It sounds pretty amazing. I mean, I think there's an interesting thing people say about when children grow up with 2 or more languages, that they actually build physical neural pathways in the brain to cope with processing language, as opposed to if you only grow up with one language, you end up having to emulate it effectively in software in the brain, and you end up with this translation capability, which you can get very good at, but you just never get the physical neural pathways, and it changes the way the brain works and the way you think. But I like your idea of I love your idea of retiring on a farm in Indonesia. My example of that is I look forward to retiring at an old age on the island of Lipari in the alien islands in the middle of the Mediterranean, and getting old and grumpy and finishing my days there. But Indonesia is a beautiful spot. Indonesia, Phil, numbers-wise, it sort of falls nicely into the sort of scale that you deal with on a day-to-day basis, because, I think there's like 16,000 islands through the entire region of Indonesia, and about 14,000.
It's a very rich archipelago, yeah.
Isn't it amazing? And about 14,000 of those are actually populated, but I think there's about 5,000 that are densely populated. I remember doing some work with BRI Bank, and they have 49 million customers. And, talking about trying to get mobile internet banking to those customers was just an amazing challenge. Now,
and mobility is picking up very fast there. I participated in the World Economic Forum sessions in Asia for a couple of years, and there you could see that. And of course, everybody knows about the take-ups of Alibaba and the other sites in Asia. But you will also see Indonesia being one of the first, if I remember it right, and the fastest growing e-commerce economy in East Asia. And the reason, of course, is that the normal shopping there is limited, to put it blunt. But on the internet, everything is available, and the smartphones that comes from what our company do at Ericsson, they are penetrating the society so fast and changing people's lives. Then comes a funny thing, which is interesting. They don't have addresses, so they have to go to a shop to pick up the stuff. But it doesn't matter. They can get stuff that they normally can't. So just shows how technology is transforming people's lives on a scale that is hard to imagine, as you say, if we sit in the West.
It is. I remember reading about how in Africa banking was almost impossible to get to, and yet when GSM was available, they started developing SMS-based transactions. And I think for the large part, they still do. And I know that Ericsson was very deeply involved in making that possible with interfaces between the banks and the banking systems and SMS messages. And still a large part of where certainly East Africa and South Africa, a lot of banking's done by SMS and GSM. And I remember seeing a thing recently that you're involved in across Ericsson, particularly your part of the business, of a rollout of a carrier in India that is effectively a data-only carrier. They don't really do voice, and they've got this mobile network rolling out at some outrageous rate where they're effectively all app-based calls. And I guess the key thing with that I noticed was what you've achieved there is in places like the region of Africa and certainly India and Southeast Asia, people haven't had to go through that dial-up modem internet experience and having a desktop PC and plugging it in, the flashing lights and the wow sound. They have gone from nothing to everything almost overnight. And now they've got in their hands this sort of smartphone with the internet walking around their pocket with them. And they've sort of joined the world. It's almost like these massive billion-plus populations have woken up. And I honestly have no idea how your business even copes with that million subscription a day challenge. Now you can
and the traffic. I will tell you, the traffic is gigantic, right? If you look at all the, I'll give you an example just so you understand. All voice traffic in the entire world, if you break that down per subscriber, it's about 20 megabytes of data that is needed to carry all the voice. If the voice was translated, as you say, in an operator that is data only, that would be a voice over IP. That would correspond to about 20 megabytes. And the average data traffic in the world right now on smartphones is 3 gigabytes, which is, an order of magnitude several on top of the 20 megabytes. So voice has become insignificant in terms of traffic. It doesn't even show up. I call it voice is noise, because you can't even see it.
Wow.
So what was telephony, which was a voice-centric business, is today an entirely data-centric business, and it's grown by about a gigabyte a year in terms of how fast it grows per user. And just in the next years, it will grow up to, I think it's in the next 5 years, it grow up to close to 20 gigabytes, per user. And just to cope with all that, every byte has to be sent through routers and technology in the systems and through the radio access over the air. So to cope with all that, we're running out of frequencies and we're running out of all kinds of things. But this is what Ericsson does.
Well, it's almost that. It's almost eye-wateringly large numbers, and when you talk about the difference between 20 meg and 3 gig, you are right. It's several orders of magnitude larger, and then multiplied by 2 kind of thing. And I guess there's no sign of slowing down either, is there?
There is no sign of slowing down. It's actually the data traffic per year, on average, grows with, if I remember right now, around 70%, I think. So, with that 70, you get almost the chessboard effect, from mythology, if you remember that. So there, and we need to cope with all that. And that's why I've also said in other interviews that, the future oil of society, if you think that oil is a scarce resource, is going to be radio frequencies.
Oh, there's no doubt about that, is there? And I guess the challenges in that sort of bandwidth space, as you said before, you can only get so many frequencies, and by the time we end up splitting them and compressing them and playing with the math, it's still a finite amount of bandwidth that's capable of carrying some data. Now, I know I read in your background that you studied at the Institute of Technology at Linköping, is it? I pronounced that correctly?
Yeah, Linköping. Yeah, that's right.
Linköping. And you did a Master of Science in the field of study of technology and business management. So you've come sort of from both a technical background and a business background. That's probably given you a very solid foundation to build on the role you've got now. In that I imagine you've got to be able to jump in the boardroom and speak plain English very slowly and clearly to business people, but then also go toe-to-toe with the technology geeks.
Yeah, no, it's true. But from the beginning, I actually did that because I thought I would become an industrial designer. And I also took industrial design in parallel, something that I did not write so much about on my LinkedIn page, but I did. And the idea was because I love arts and I love painting and drawing and so on. So I thought this was going to be my profession. And when I started at Ericsson, I started modestly by making a few designs on, trying to draw some of the base stations for commercial purpose, to show, rendering pictures, which is what's used in some of the publications that Ericsson put out in 1990. But that did not become my career. So other parts of that education weren't more useful, I soon found out. So,
well, I think we're better off having you where you are now, that's for sure, because you have an enormous width and breadth and depth that you focus on now. And in fact, I would love to dive into that a bit more if you can, just around the actual role itself. Could you maybe just for listeners and myself, just give us a bit more definition around when we say the Senior Vice President and Head of the Business Area Digital Services, what does that role itself entail within the organization of Ericsson?
Well, it's, like many very large companies, we are divided up in business areas and market areas. In one way or another, I would guess that most big, large industrial companies are organized like that. This is what I'm running now, is a business area. And the one that is dealing with basically all kinds of IT systems and technology around monetizing networks, running networks, and so forth. Okay. I think it's a role that I've had now since April. It's a very big challenge because we're actually not profitable enough, so we're working very hard on a big turnaround of the unit. At the same time, the growth in this segment in the market is somewhere around 5-6% per year. So in telecom terms, that's good, because most of the telecom world is not growing. Our operators are not growing. They haven't grown since 2007, actually. In the network segment is not growing either. It's actually flat to a little bit down, a couple of percentage points down on an annual basis. So the growth of the future in the telecom sector lies in managing all the bytes and bits that we just talked about, being able to monetize that, and actually creating completely new services towards enterprises and so forth, that they can use what we call the 5G technology and all that. And in that sits the business area I'm now running. Before this, I was CTO for almost 6 years of the Ericsson Group, which was, a good foundation for being able to create 5G. During my time, we actually did that. So I'm very excited and proud that we were able to bring the next generation mobile telephony to life. And there were lots of people after 4G that asked, is there going to be a new generation? Are we doing, what do we need it for? Now, knowing that we've asked all the way back since what you mentioned, Des, on GSM, which was today called 2G. 2G was after 1G, which was an analog version before, which was not as roaming capable as you described it. And then we've had the Gs coming, and then people say, what do we need it for? They ask that every generation. And during my time as CTO, we were able to nail that down. It coincided with the whole notion of IoT and, that internet would actually connect every microprocessor out there, as they call about this parallel universe I talked about, that was just happening in parallel with mobile telephony's enormous take-up, and we were able to marry that into 5G, which leads us to a system that has a total new performance level compared to what you would find in 4G or earlier generations. And before that, I was running radio, so I've done my piece on the mobile telephony part, and now I'm doing my piece on how our customers can better monetize it and better make money out of the future generations of mobile telephony.
Well, I think it's an amazing pedigree to have behind you. I think when we look at roles like the CIO role, for example, there's been a shift from technically savvy CIOs to more business savvy CIOs, and they swung one way and then the other. Now there's sort of a marriage in between. I think you've got this amazing background of business and technology now to take this thing on. where it's a good blend, because I don't think anybody can take it on with a pure business or financial focus or marketing focus or sales focus, but I don't think anyone that's purely technical can do it either. I think that's that magic blend you've got, which is going to hold you in very good stead. I'm sure it already does. Now, you talked about 5G. You must have a lot to do with the 3GPP part of the project of getting the standard of 5G in place. What does that look like on a day-to-day basis in your world as far as the team around you and your involvement in 3GPP?
Well, 3GPP was actually created by Ericsson. We needed, and why it's called 3GPP is because it's a partnership program that would pre-work all the standardization when we were creating 3G to later put it into ETSI, which actually does the standardization. So the role, for many years I've been working with that. It's actually funny because as we sit here in Kista today, we are just announcing, just before Christmas here, that the radio standard, the NR standard, is actually today announced as ready.
Oh wow!
So we're going, When people hear this, it's going to be a little bit after that. But today we're going to make a press release about that. So I'm safe to say that. But I think it is a fantastic development that we've done on the radio interface, which is first done. But if you then go to the core network, which is part of what I do now in digital services, we have to wait a little bit more. We're working on the standard, and it's going to be coming out, I think, in the first half of next year in different releases and so forth. So 5G is becoming real. I would say we're going to see the first systems really scaling up to some sort of real deployments in the mid of 2019, because that's when the devices are coming, and the chips and the even handheld terminals on 5G actually.
That's an exciting piece of news, quote unquote, a headline then, and thank you very much for that. I think one of the biggest challenges has been the whole standard around NR, given that at the end of the day the signals are still technically radio, right? Yeah,
it's radio signals. I mean, we still have Shannon's law, if you know how to transmit with, and transmission capability versus bandwidth. That is, we're approaching how much you can actually transmit given a certain bandwidth. Every day I read about someone on the internet who says they broke Shannon's law, but they never did.
No.
So, but we, with that we have, and we're of course using technology on the radio side to its largest extent with massive MIMO solutions. We have a coding now that is basically totally amazing if you compare to the kind of codings that we were using when we were doing GSM in terms of speeds and capabilities. And we're using a combination of these technologies to be able to transmit as much as possible. 5G also holds a capability to launch in much higher frequency spectrums. As I said, we're running out of frequency a bit, so it's good if we can use more spectrum. But we're also able to launch it on very low spectrums, which means that it can be interleaved into the existing mobile technologies. For a technologist, you would say that 5G is kind of a radio dream. It is so flexible, it's so fast, and it's going to get this standardization done by the announcement today, which is coming later today. And with that, you're going to see the same fantastic growth curve that you get in our industry because of the standards that we talked about on GSM, for example.
Well, I guess, and for folk listening who may not know, you mentioned MIMO and massive MIMO. Effectively, we're talking about very large...
Lots of antennas.
Yeah, very large arrays of antennas, right?
Lots.
Because we sort of have this problem of trying to get the amount of bandwidth, if you like, from one place to another just for the connectivity and carriage. But a lot of them have kind of not so much been band-aids, but attempts to kind of bridge that gap between 3 and 4G, and then some people talked about 4.5G. But really, as you said, the quantum leap, if you like, I don't know if that's the appropriate description, to what 5G will be, where 3G was kind of like voice, 4G kind of made video possible, but it was very much downward streaming. 5G is going to be a return path, isn't it? It's like it's not just increasing the capability of the signal to the consumer, but it's also a return path.
No, absolutely. Now I'll see if I can remember this. But if you compare, I mean, first you had analog, and that was a voice channel basically running. A voice channel at that time was a 64 kilobit thing that you ran if you transfer it to data. It would be that. That was a PCM speed that all telecom networks had at the time. And this is in 1980s, so it's a while ago. But everybody thought that was pretty amazing that you could make mobile calls. Then we come into GSM, and GSM was able to compress those voice calls down to 14 kilobit per second vocoders, that was called. And then we could have compressed all that into 200 kilohertz channels, and we were able to make much more capacity over time on GSM systems. And then everybody said, well, we should be able to do data here. And we launched a fantastic data system that had the speed of 20 kilobits per second. And that, this is the time of modems. Modems could do more, but this was mobile. We had to live with those 20 kilobits, and people thought that was pretty good. And I've even seen internet pages downloaded on 24 kilobits and so on.
Yeah.
Now, if you compare, then came 3G, 384 kilobits per second. We were never going to run out of capacity. This was amazing. You could do video telephony on 64 kilobit inside 3G. And we were now going to go up to 5 megahertz channels. And we did all that in 3G. And then quickly ran out of capacity because now data consumption started to really grow. So we started to take 3G through the use of something called HSPA, which was a new technology that could make the throughputs much higher. So we went up to two megabytes
yep.
of megabits of data transmission speed. 2 went to 10, 10 went to 20, 20 went to 40, 40 went to 80, all of that. And then we said, well, we need a new generation. We need something that is based on a radio technology called OFDMA. Let's try to do that. So then came the ideas of 4G. No one could wait for 4G. So Ericsson came up with, we had a meeting with Docomo, I remember here in Kista, and we came up with a plan for the long-term evolution into 4G. And that became LTE. So even the word LTE comes from our company when we created that.
Wow.
And LTE became pretty big. I told you before all the number of subscriptions. And so anyways, it's been just amazing with these consumptions. And then if you look at 5G now, we think it's going to be so much capacity. We're saying we're going to have 20 gigabits of speeds, 20 gigabits compared to LTE, which was designed for 100. It was designed for 150 megabits per second, and today we can bring LTE up to 1 gigabit, or a little bit more than that. But to go to 20 now will give us eternal, which I don't believe. So we will run out. We just don't know when.
It's like a multi-lane freeway, isn't it? We always hear state and federal government say, "Oh, it's a 2-lane freeway; it'll never get filled up with cars." It's a 4-lane freeway. No. I was in the US recently, and I had the mind-boggling experience of being on a 10-lane freeway, and it was full of cars. It's one of those things where, what do they say in that famous movie about the baseball? It's like, you build it, they will come. Now, I know there's a number of really big things that you deal with on a regular basis, and I want to touch on a couple of them, particularly net neutrality, GDPR, and that eventually this whole concept around building a sustainable future, that's part of the whole motto that's on your LinkedIn profile. But could we chat a bit just about the challenge of net neutrality in your world? What is that? How does that even work in your world, given the challenges that come with what net neutrality means?
Well, net neutrality is a concept where basically the concept is that there are people who do the services and there are people who do the networks. And that division was not there from the beginning. We've talked here about GSM and this. You remember all through the 90s and the beginning of this millennium, we were convinced that the services and the service providers would be the same.
Yeah.
But the launch of the iPhone, I would say very much an Apple thinking, was that let's bring all these services out of the network. Let's try to provide something that is much bigger. Otherwise, we'll be limited to innovation of service providers when it comes to new services. And that happened. And it was just waiting to be happening, I think. There's already been other launches done before that by a number of internet companies who could provide services that were more exciting, faster, innovative than the 3-4 service provider per market could really provide. And that means that we've seen an explosion in that side, but it also created some giants on really providing the services, like Google, Facebook, and the internet companies, the large internet companies. And they have, of course, thrived from networks. There's no doubt. There would be no Google and there would be no Facebook and no Amazon without the network. So they've been using this, of course, to create an enormous opportunity and also, the fastest growing industry on the planet. Now, as it comes down, the wish from the service providers to be able to build more networks, build more capacity. You remember what I said about data and the amazing growth to 3 gigabytes per user now, and we'll go to 20 gigabytes in just a few years. All of that has to be paid for. Somehow those networks has to be built, and they have to be expanded. And therefore, there is a wish from the service providers to actually say, if we provide you with a better service, a bigger pipe, a better functioning pipe, and in 5G, even a faster pipe, we would like to get paid for that. And they want to have a monetary transaction between themselves and someone using the network for providing these services. That is not just a big data bucket. And that's the whole essence of this net neutrality debate. So you would say, the other side says, well, hang on a second, if you're going to charge for these things, what about me, small internet company, want to launch a service that could grow the same way that Google has grown, or they've grown on an algorithm. There might be a new algorithm out there. It might be someone new who wants to innovate something. They would like not to pay for all that usage. They would like to have as free start as Google and the other guys have. And therefore, it's called net neutrality. It means network should be neutral to the internet providers or internet service developers. And in the U.S. for a while, laws were being made, and it's been particularly much in North America, very, very U.S.-centric debate, to be very honest. Europe has not yet prohibited operators from having financial transactions done to companies who create services as much. There has been an example, but not so much. And in China, there's no debate at all. I mean, there there are relationships between service providers and people who develop new services. I think if 5G is going to be a reality, we are going to get used to the thought that, there is a difference between pipes here. I think someone who is driving on a remote controlled car or having worst case eye surgery done with remote surgery service using a 5G network would not like the guy standing on the corner playing his computer game to slow down the service. That would be devastating, right? So we have to divide these services into different buckets, and therefore by 5G, we're going to see net neutrality debate, I think, weakening, because it's obvious that there has to be an opportunity for someone who builds a network that is so responsive as 5G, with milliseconds of delay, very big pipes being able to be opened up, to have some differentiation of service northbound to people who develop new services for people.
Well, I think eventually what happens, and we've sort of seen it in different formats over the last 2.5 decades, is if enough people get their hands on the throat of the internet, they do eventually strangle it. I know, and you're right. I mean, a lot of people think about, consumers are up in arms around the world, particularly in the US, because I think it was December the 14th this month. In the US, the FCC Republican majority approved, I think its chairman is Ajit Pai's plan to essentially pull the net neutrality protections apart and start to allow carriers to do that. And
right. I've met him several times, and I met the former chairman of FCC a lot as well. But I think we will see a more sober debate about this, because sometimes the tones of the debate has become that this is the freedom of internet. It's about consumer democracy in some way. Even the democracy debate has been tangled into this, which I think is an illusion. And why it's an illusion is because the reality is that if there are no networks, the worst thing that can happen in a democracy is that it's silent.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think, we need to be able to develop networks to be able to facilitate. And with the people who argue these things, many times don't see that traffic growth that you and I are talking about. That's seen as just technical terms.
Absolutely, and
but it's a very big reality, I can tell you, for us who build networks and build systems to manage them.
Well, in many ways, I hate to say it, but I think there's an aged debate that's held in very much a 1986 era mentality around what the internet used to be.
Yes.
And I think, particularly in North America, and God bless America, but in many ways they've experienced that transition from sort of telcos and ISPs and the AT&Ts and so forth of the world being the only place you can get an email address, and then along came AOL, that was not a carrier, and that classic "You've Got Mail" in that movie, the film, whatever it was, that became famous, and then all of a sudden you sort of had this transition from the carrier to sort of an internet service provider to an AOL. And then we sort of saw it happen out on the internet at large in what we now call the cloud, I guess, with what was Hotmail and then Yahoo. And, and now everybody has some sort of webmail of some form and has no idea what the relationship they've got to the network is. And I think in many ways, a lot of the fear factor in some parts, it's very emotive in my personal opinion, around net neutrality is built around those very old ideas of what the internet might have been a couple of decades ago. But as you've just alluded to, we've got other parts of the world that are moving so quickly, sprinting at what 5G will bring about. And I think in many ways it'll become one of those user pay things. I think one of my favorite analogies around this is the price of a cup of coffee. Now, some people want the convenience of a $2 coffee either at McDonald's on a drive-through or at the airport. And others want to pay $7 for a barista to make them the best cappuccino on the planet, but it takes them 8 minutes. And so I think there's going to be this drive to consumers learning around this maturity, if you like, where they can choose. Yeah. And they already do that, right? I mean, they already do that. A million people signing up today on the Ericsson network. They choose the data plan, the quality of the phone, the network, and the price point. And I think that's going to drive it more than anything. I don't think anything governments and carriers can do or whatever is going to change that, because if one carrier behaves badly, people will just churn. That's the beauty of today's technology. Now, there's another really big topic I'd love to throw at you, and I hope you don't mind, but particularly in your neighborhood, GDPR, the Global Data Protection Regulation coming out of Europe. A lot of people look at it in sort of, North America, certainly Southeast Asia and Australia, in my world, go, oh, this is a European problem. But then I always put my hand up and say, well, hang on, where are you in the supply chain for some of your partners around the world? And they're like, well, what does that mean? I was like, well, if you're doing some sort of fulfillment and there's an address coming to you via email or database that you have to deliver to, or if there's an internet billing service, or if I buy a Gmail account and I buy it out of a European provider, GDPR comes into play. I imagine that GDPR is kind of like another Y2K event that we're all just trying to come to grips with, and it must have an even more foundational shake effect in your world in the telco, because data is moving over your network that is going to be GDPR compliant requirements, but also the whole challenge of the multi-layered sort of security and compliance and encryption. How does one even begin that conversation around GDPR and the world of Ericsson and carriers?
No, general data protection regulation is something that I think is very fundamentally very positive. Actually, I think people are starting to form opinions and react to the, I would say, intrusion of privacy that many of these internet capabilities that we have is actually doing to us. He knows where we've been, knows who we talk to, knows everything, and some of that is used to make better services for us. As people say, the consumer industry is going towards companies guessing what you would like to see, or guessing what you would like to listen to, or guessing what you would like to buy. And that might be very helpful, but in general, to just let all this data free flow without people being in control of what data they have and they're willing to share, I think is not going to be in the actual consumer interest. It will stress people to a level that I think, and it will also provide security risks for people, or make security risks possible for people that they cannot even imagine. Even with AI now, we there are systems that can figure out things that you don't even know about yourself. So I think in that sense, I think this regulation is overdue a bit. I think it should have been introduced earlier in this type. I think the service providers of the world are probably the best capable organizations of anonymizing data and making sure that you have consent. You have to remember that they are, the customers of Ericsson, if you will, the AT&Ts and of the world, and the Telstras of the world in Australia, and Optus, and all the carriers of the different countries. They are very used to having a high and pretty strict level of privacy around your accounts and how that is managed. Yeah. It's when the new services were introduced that in order to use this app, you need to click here, where you, by the way, give consent in a very long, very small text written that you never have time to really look at. And besides, your screen on smartphone is too small to even read it. And then you put yes, and then you can move to the big service where the reward is that you get a lot of music or you get a lot of fun. And that way, people have said yes to a lot of things that they have no idea about. Apps of where your location is about is the normal thing that is shared in almost any app now. So I think in that sense, I'm quite positive that this General Data Protection Regulation will provide service provider with a tool to also be able to tell consumers that we can secure that your data is anonymized and it's not personal, which is really where the whole regulation is built on consent. So you have to give consent for usage and so forth on every level. So it's consent of the people who use it. It's consent to the next level. So data is not just shared and handed down through a long link of people sharing data. So in that sense, it's positive. Negative side maybe is that this comes pretty blunt, and a lot of companies need to adjust to it, banks and others, which is hard because you have multinational operations. And you have to store data within country, and there are lots of other things that are another side of the coin. So that side is also tough for many companies, including our own, to be really fully compliant with. But as from a consumer point of view, I think it is an eye opener for many to understand that actually regulators are doing something to make sure that consumer data and privacy is regarded in a new way.
Absolutely, and I think when you alluded to this point earlier on, but just to recap on it, your industry in the telco space, certainly banking, the whole financial services industry of banking, wealth management, asset management, insurance, etc. I mean, they've had to live with this in effect with a combination of KYC, know your client, and anti-money laundering, AML. They've had to be able to vet the consumers to make sure that they're not doing something criminal, but they've also had to report on it. So I think we know that organizations can cope with it. Maybe this is another order of magnitude or two when it's sort of taken to web scale, as we say. But I think we've seen a couple of little analogies here that I can link to. I mean, we've seen, and there's a really interesting phrase I always like to call out, and that is that I read somewhere someone said, and I have to figure out who it was and be able to quote them, but they said something to the effect that if you are not paying for a product or a service, then you are in effect the product yourself. And as you said, when you click on a box for whatever, I'm not going to pick on a brand name, but if you have a streaming service for video or audio and you get it for free, you have to assume they're going to sell your data for something, whether it's advertising or something else, because otherwise how do they stay in business, right? They've got to make money somehow.
Right. Well, it's the whole idea. And I think here is the real notion. I mean, we're coming from a telco space, building networks, providing people with smartphones. There are, I think, more than 4 billion smartphones now. We're approaching 4.5 billion smartphones in the world. Phones that have apps, and you can click and do things on them. And I think it's an amazing growth in that space. And then you have the other space, which you allude to, web scale. Web scale is really all these services it's just a service creation based on the IP standard and the internet that is just phenomenal. It goes into make our lives easier by the day. These two worlds, when they meet, there is either love in some places, get amazing apps like Netflix, fast growth, big networks. The only reason networks exist is because networks allow it to exist. because
Yeah.
otherwise it can't be there, right? So we're going to break so many barriers in so many areas of digitalization where these two universes meet. And then all of a sudden there are some disagreements like net neutrality. There are some disagreements like there are on general data protection, because these are the modern problems of these two universes meeting. And you will see that again and again and again. And they're always going to come a pragmatic view. I'm a pragmatist. I believe in people solving problems. So there's going to always be pragmatic view that allows services, but there's going to be a little bit more regulation. It's going to be a little bit. And, it's the same with security, internet security, which is hottest topic. It's the same as bank security. The banks that existed in the Wild West, you could walk in and take the money if you had a gun. You can't really do that today. There's no money to start with. But I think those have just been raising on the security level gradually. So that's we're going to see the same development here. It's a gradual evolution of new services. I
like the analogy of the bank robbery, because I read an article the other day where here in Australia somebody went to rob a bank, and there was
very interesting.
So little money left in the bank for them to rob. They actually robbed all the people in the bank that were there as customers, because that was the only place they could get any money.
There is no money there anymore. No. And by the way, they don't need bank offices either. And you see that, that's what we do in my unit in digital services, for example. Operators today have little shops downtown, and you don't even know which shop you're in, right? I mean, you go into one shop. I was going to the so-and-so shop. Oh, well, this is not this one. It's next door. And the people working there, they keep rotating, so they don't even know which operator they work for anymore. So that's not the relationship that you want.
No.
That's not the relationship you want with your consumers anymore. You want a totally digital relationship where people get value for their services and so on. And that's what we do at Ericsson Digital Services. We provide operators with a digital interface to all their users, where you can marry all these different channels. You can marry that with any apps, any other relationships that you have in a totally digital experience, and that translates back to the network and the changes that is needed to do in the network to provide different capabilities, different speeds, different pipes, if you will, going back to what we talked about before, to different consumers or to different enterprises or different companies that would like to use 5G for IoT, for example.
Absolutely. Now, I know we're running out of time here, so there's a couple of things I'd like to throw at you in a second. But one of the exciting things that, from what you're just saying now, one of the most exciting things I saw when we had the opportunity to do the behind-the-scenes tour, and thank you again for that, with the Ericsson studio, was that it was clear to me that you actually were customer number one. You were already putting yourselves, Ericsson, and the whole business services group, through this digital transformation yourself, the shift to clouds, shift to adopting AI, analytics, big data, etc., the transformation of putting IoT capabilities into the organization. Effectively, I saw, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I had the opinion and the view that after this tour, Ericsson was effectively customer number one. You were buying this stuff from yourselves, in a sense, proving it worked in your own organization. And then in turn, after having productized it for your own purposes, making it available to your partners and resellers, in effect. Is that a fair assumption, sort of a way to describe what you're doing?
No, it's a fair assumption. I mean, every large company has to go through very big transitions. Ericsson has done that through our more than 140 years history. And, we started with telephony. We started with telephones, actually, and telegraphs repairs, and eventual telephone production. And through this journey, we've gone from those wooden phones through all these things that led us to where we are now. When I started, we were going through the transition of becoming a mobile company. We added radio engineers by the day. Now we are doing a transition to become a digital transformation type of business based on software.
Yep.
And the unit I'm running, the BA that I'm running, is purely a software company. We have some 13,000 software engineers building and doing different software components in a large number. I think we have 27 different R&D sites globally. We do that to be able to provide these new types of systems. Technology like AI or analytics and so on is what it's foundation for doing that. That's what people work with. So I would say when I'm now a little bit above 50, but I noticed that when I go out in these R&D units, they're half my age, but they do amazing things. They do absolutely amazing things to just keep up with the technology and development that we will provide to our customers, so they can go beyond what those shops can provide them, so they can do things that are going to be absolutely necessary to be competitive in the 5G era that we're just about to launch.
Well, the great thing is that anyone that's receiving services, either physical infrastructure or virtualized or cloudified or whatever it might be, from what your team are doing, they're already certain that you're using it yourselves. Because I caught up with Mats Carlson the other day, and he had this great line where he said that in the days of physical servers and routers and switches and servers, it might take 8 months to roll out a new service, but now it takes like 8 minutes, because it's a microservice on Kubernetes and Docker, and it was running in your own OpenStack cloud. And it's such a fundamental shift from months to minutes is just mind-boggling. And I remember talking to Jan Carlson about the business services side of the organization he runs for you, and he had a similar thing, saying that, in many ways you build infrastructure now not for a bespoke environment, whether it's a billing system or an onboarding platform or a sign-up process or billing, but you build this capability where there's this malleable component where if you want to sign up 1 million people, as and when that sign-up process is required, you instantiate the environment to take all the connections and logins and passwords and PCI requirement. And then when it's finished, you burn it down, and that infrastructure becomes free again in that cloud model. And so when you roll that out around the world, I think, you're already doing that for yourselves. So for others...
Cloud for us is just an amazing capacity booster, because now all of a sudden we can do, just like you say, we can seamlessly do things over a much larger virtual area. And I think that's the synergy of cloud. But the speeds that we can achieve, it's just so significant from a process change in the customers. And I believe there's very little differentiation in actually just the voice service or many of these things that are built again and again and again in service provider areas. So therefore, they could be delivered over cloud. And I think cloud technology is just about to hit the telecom sector the same way it hit the IT sector. I mean, today you get the whole office suite of things that you do from a cloud, and you don't even blink an eye. It's even safer than it was when you were running the servers in the basement. So I believe that's the track we're on is to be able to offer our customers the same capabilities out of telecom clouds that can be just table stakes for them to be in the business. They can focus on that digital relationship to consumers, to enterprises, and develop their business to the next level, where the networks of 5G can provide the foundation of that.
Absolutely. And in fact, when you're talking about security there earlier on, it reminded me that, when we look at cloud and what will become the telecom cloud that you're building, it's far more likely to be the case that the thousands of people in your organization focused on availability and connectivity and security are going to outweigh by so many orders of magnitude. It's immeasurable. Any enterprise capability, for me, even if I was a company with 100,000 people running a bank, I might only have 20 people in security, whereas you might have 3,000 people. I can never compete with that, and getting that as a cloud service from you is going to be so much better.
That's where exactly, because that's where the business aspect. If the businessman sees what cloud technology can do from a rationalization and specialization perspective, that's what you talk about.
Yeah,
you can use specialists in an area to solve a problem which is very complex, that don't have to be solved over and over again. And that's exactly what happened in the IT industry. So when business people see this, they will quickly go to that, because it's a smarter way of doing the business. If it's a non-differentiating service and you're able to use specialists in one area, go to the cloud. So we're going to see this happening through the telco sector over the next years to come now. It's just starting. So you will see that in a very large scale, which I think will bring the entire telco sector to focus on what those new networks can really do for enterprises. And that coincides with the parallel universe that's happening, and that is that all enterprises are digitalizing in the world. If those two get married, I don't know where it will all end, but it will be very, very exciting to see company after company after company digitalize. Myself, I'm on the board of a large lock company, the world's largest, Assa Abloy, which is selling locks to all over the world. And we can see that enterprises' locks and those lock systems are now totally digitalized. It's more about identity management and how to handle identities going in and out of buildings or access to different things. That's now also coming over to the private sector, where people would like to have goods that they bought off the internet shipped home. People can open the door, put it inside by having a one-time access to the lock. They know who they are. It's all, you could identify who does it. In elderly care, we can use the same type of system to make sure that people can get into take care of elderly who want to be treated in their homes. And it's a much safer way, and it's an enormous digitization. What does that mean for the service provider? It means that they can tailor-make the network services for such an enterprise, and therefore they also need a digital interface to those enterprises, tying all that together.
Yeah.
So that's a new society. That's a very, very fast-growing opportunity for service providers.
It is very exciting. Now, to put some context in what you just mentioned there in passing, I mean, when you say that you sit on the board of Asa Abloy, I mean, this is a company with 10 billion annual turnover, about 55,000 staff. They come from a very big infrastructure background. I think you said for like jail, locks, and other heavy industry. But it is exciting to see that move. Now, I remember seeing the car in your Ericsson studio, and where the conversation led around the idea of the boot having a special digital lock being enabled, so that you could have fulfillment from DHL or some retailer could fulfill directly to the boot of your car, and they knew the car was located, the car park in front of the Ericsson buildings there in Schister, and you ordered something online. You might have ordered dinner, and all the ingredients get brought to your car, dropped in there, kept nice and cold because it's freezing. And you just got out of work, got in the car, drove home, and you knew that all of your shopping was in the back of the car. I mean, that's a very exciting thing. And in fact, it links directly to what was on that wall. I remember seeing with the 17 different tenets around the United Nations desire to just make life better. Now, I know we're coming up close to the hour, and you've got a hard stop. I would love, if you don't mind, before we wrap up, I'd love to hand you a virtual crystal ball and get you to gaze into it for a couple of minutes. I'm very keen for you to kind of share, if you were to grab this virtual crystal ball and gaze into it for a couple of seconds, in 3 to 5 or more years, big ideas, big trends, big disruptions. I mean, we've had a plethora of them already today on cloud, big data analytics, telephony, 5G, and I'm very excited to hear you share the announcement today around the NR component, the standard being released and announced today. Thank you for that. If that wasn't good enough, what other big things do you think are coming down the line? Where are the big shifts? Do you think are they going to be in the humanities space that changes, or do you think there's other big technical or commercial or business shifts coming about? What does it look like if you gaze into that crystal ball over the next 3 to 5 years?
Well, for me, I think it's very, very important for us. And when I'm looking into the crystal ball, I see technology development at a very large scale, a little bit what we already talked about. But I think I would like to say that the human aspect is equally important or more important. We need to, as humans, relate to this technology more. So in my crystal ball, those things comes together. I think in the Sustainable Development Goals that you just mentioned, the 17 goals, which will be reached by 2030. It was part of the 2030 agenda, and I was actually in New York the day that they were announced as a CTO of Ericsson, representing how technology and humans come together. And the goal number 9 is the one for infrastructure. But these goals also, I think the industry that we are working with, the high-tech industry, has the solution to many, many of these goals. But at the same time, it has to be done with the human aspect and with human aspects being regarded, so technology doesn't become scary or do the wrong things. Then we will never get to where we want. So I think a sustainable society is a global society where the goals that were put up by UN, which I think is covering the human aspects very well, can be developed in such a way that we still respect humans, their cultures, their way of living in a good way, and that we can support humanity's development in a very positive direction. I'm an optimist. I think we will do that. But I also see in many of the debates, many of the topics we talked about today on this podcast are related to how we are trying to cope with the marriage between human aspects, privacy, for example, and the new technology development. I think if we do this well, enterprises will be brought to a new level. We will be able to find enterprises positively working towards reaching these goals and towards building a better society for us. We need to regulate that with the same aspects, but we also need the technology development to get faster and safer. And large companies like Ericsson certainly has a very important responsibility to make sure that happens in a very good way. And we're going to take that. So I feel optimistic that we will have many of these goals being reached through the use of technology. And then I'm thinking about poverty, as well as hunger. We haven't even talked about what this will do for agriculture, but it's an enormous change going on right there. But it's also things like gender equality. If we look at the technology, predominantly a male sector today, that's another thing we need to work with and change to be able to build this more sustainable society. So I think there are so many aspects of this, and I am very optimistic that we will come out on the other side with a society that people also have time to talk to each other and just relate to each other, supported by technology in a positive way.
Well, there were three key tenets that I walked away from the week with your amazing team and meeting yourself a couple of weeks ago. And I wrote them down on the plane on the way home, which is something ridiculous, like a 27-hour flight back to back.
It is very long.
It is a long flight. I wrote down three things: livelihood, lifestyle, and leisure. I saw those, and when I read the Ericsson Mobility Report 2017 edition just on the way back home as well, and thank you for the copy of that in hard copy, that really rang true to me. They're the three key tenets I sort of took away from that yes, you've got to make money as a business, and yes, you've got to transform the technology. But at the end of the day, what I left with was this hope that kind of being realized that I was pretty confident that my 13-year-old son and 16-year-old daughter's futures were in good hands, not just with Ericsson, the brand, but also with the team around you personally and the team around the organization. And I want to just say a quick final congratulations. Now, to this day, December 22nd, actually, so it's actually the 21st of Australia here, December 22nd, 2016, you wrote a blog and you stated that 2017 would be the momentous year for 5G. And all the things we've just spoken about were what you predicted in your blog exactly 1 year ago. So I just want to say congratulations on being able to read the future. So all the things you've just spoken about in that crystal ball, people should write them down, because you got it right a year ago, and I suspect you've absolutely nailed it and got it right today. So look, Ulf Ewaldsson, Senior Vice President and Head of Business Area Digital Services for Ericsson, thank you so much for making such an amazing amount of time available for me in your crazy busy schedule. It's been an absolute pleasure catching up with you.
Likewise, it was great to have this talk, and thank you so much for having me.